Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome to Lawsplaining the Interwebs. I am your host, Nick Rekieta of Rekieta Law, a small law firm in central Minnesota, as you know. I have a guest today whose name is Stephen Gutowski. He is a Washington Free Beacon reporter. It's Washington Free Beacon still, right? Not just Free Beacon.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just wanted to make sure that my brain didn't get scrambled there. Yeah, he's a Washington Free Beacon reporter. He has been reporting on the Cody Wilson story, which of course you know I am following on this channel as well. So I asked him if he'd be so kind to come on to my show. We'd have a little discussion about kind of the state of things, and with maybe some particular focus on why the media can't seem to report on 3D guns or even any sort of guns in any sort of intelligible manner. At least in my experience, and if I'm not mistaken, that seems to be your experience as well. So,
yes, very much. That's my whole life.
So,
Very much.
Since I'm kind of getting to know you here, and I have seen the Free Beacon kind of tangentially, just being generally on the right. Myself, I will run across Free Beacon articles here and there, but I don't follow them exclusively. And so just kind of getting to know you, can you tell us a little bit about, I guess, where you come from, how you got to the Free Beacon, what your background is?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I started off writing about politics in college. I was actually started my own blog back when blogging was like a thing that you could still do, which is kind of, there's maybe 3 or 4 blogs left in the world now, but back in the golden age of blogs, like 2008 to 2009,
The glory days.
I started this was back when people really thought they could actually make a living or make money off of blogging, and I definitely thought that, which is exactly why I got started. And I guess eventually it did work out because, I have a career in this stuff now, but of course I never made any money off of my own website. But the interesting thing from way back then was my blog was called The College Politico, and it wasn't named after Politico, which came into existence around the same time. But Politico sure thought that it was, and
Right.
They actually threatened to sue me. They sent me a cease and desist, this college kid, that I was infringing on their trademarks by using the word Politico in my name. So that's how I got started.
So you got dipped right into it.
Yeah, and I won that, by the way. They never got that site from me. I still own it.
Nice.
I got some pro bono help. And they never ended up suing me. They just their expensive lawyers would send me mean letters every once in a while, and then they just sort of gave up altogether after a while. Kind of weird, actually, thinking about it now. But regardless, then I got into then I came down to DC, and I started working for the Media Research Center, which is a media watchdog group. But I was doing more like blogging, writing pieces, and slowly started to write more and more original pieces. And then from there, I went to the Free Beacon and became more of a sort of full-fledged hard news reporter, right? Now, mostly what I do is write original news stories about gun policy in the United States. And a fair share of media criticism still, because it's just so bad out there when it comes to guns. The reporting is so bad,
laughably terrible. And so with this story, of course, we've got the 3D printed guns, and the thing that has struck out to me so much is the idea that these guns are entirely plastic, that they're completely untraceable, and that that they could be smuggled onto like an airplane and somehow used in some way to hijack the airplane. Do you want to address like that at all?
Yeah, I mean, there's been so much misinformation about 3D printed guns and what's going on with the Cody Wilson case and the law surrounding that, and even what's like at issue in the case has been so poorly reported. But yeah, I mean, one of the big lies, I would call it, or at least big pieces of misinformation, is this idea that these 3D printed guns are first of all that you download a file, you click a button, and it just prints you out a fully working gun made completely out of plastic. None of that stuff is true. Right? If you wanted to build, the closest thing to a fully plastic gun that exists now is Cody Wilson's Liberator, which he designed in 2013. It's been out there for 6 years now almost. And
and those watching the video can see that is broken down on the bottom left of the screen. It's the breakdown of all the Liberator parts, and you'll notice there is a nail included, which is the firing pin.
Right, and you'll also notice that it's 16 separate parts that you have to individually print those parts, and then you have to assemble them. So there's that part. It doesn't just come out. It's not like a magic 3D printers. There's always been this like mystic, atmosphere surrounding them in the media, even without, putting aside guns, that they're just like magic replicators from sci-fi TV shows. It's really not what they are at all. But basically, you print out the parts, you assemble them. It's not a fully plastic gun. It's not undetectable, is the term that you would the people would use for like a gun that could pass through a metal detector or an X-ray machine.
Right.
We have a very aptly named law that deals with these sorts of firearms. It's called the Undetectable Firearms Act of 1988, and it makes it illegal for you to manufacture or possess a gun that would be able to pass through a walk-through metal detector or a X-ray machine as used commonly at airports. So even if you could design a 3D printed gun that was made completely out of plastic parts, and which has never happened, as you mentioned, Wilson's gun uses a metal firing pin probably mostly because you need to. It's impossible. It'd be pretty much impossible to set off a primer of a commercially available cartridge with a plastic firing pin. It probably just wouldn't work. But so there's all kinds of myths around it, and that's really just one or two of them. There's so many more.
Right. And the thing that gets me is, part of what I have talked about a little bit in the past is the idea, like there are multiple parts of security on I guess a national or a large scale level, and one of those parts is security theater. But what we were sold on with the TSA was the idea that these backscatter imaging devices could actually detect stuff like the Liberator. You didn't need a metal component because this thing would just shoot some shortwave radiation through clothes that would stop on skin or other large objects. So in theory, if you tried to pack a Liberator on your hip and walk through a backscatter imaging service or device, the lack of metal wouldn't stop anything. But the thing that really gets me is that, there's a big metal component that all guns require, and that's a bullet. I don't know. I mean, I know they have rubber rounds for riot control, but I believe even those come in brass casings.
Yeah. I mean, they make like polymer rounds now too, I guess, where the bullet is made of polymer, but again, that would still come in a metal casing of some sort.
Right, because if you put it in some sort of plastic or polymer casing, you'd have real issues with the casing compromising at the time of explosion and causing, I would assume, some sort of ballistic problem with a bullet, but I'm not an expert.
Most likely. You know what else is interesting about that is there's been this one of in the sort of media hype and hysteria over all this. There's been an image of this particular gun that the TSA, or this particular item that the TSA found in Reno in 2016, which is a little plastic Derringer revolver, right? And this picture of this thing has been all over the place. When people are discussing 3D printed guns in the media, and interestingly, you never hear the backstory of what that is. Like, what was that? Why is that coming up? And I looked it up, and it turns out that thing was not a gun. It was a replica. oddly, it was a replica that held actual 22 long rifle rounds in it. It was discovered. Perhaps the most interesting part is that it's fully made out of plastic from all appearances. But the TSA actually found that thing
Right.
during a baggage scan, during an X-ray. So even with a fully plastic replica of a Derringer, not an actual functioning firearm, even with that, they were still able to find it and detect it. And also the guy who had it, this was in Reno, Nevada, so who knows what this guy was doing, or how he forgot that he had this weird little plastic replica on him. But he was not charged. He was given the option of checking that item, or because it had live ammunition in it. That wasn't an actual gun. He could either have checked it but he decided to leave it, just let them have it and go on with his life, board the plane and fly away. So, that's an example. One of, bad reporting on this is the implication has been that this was a real 3D printed gun made totally of plastic, which it's not. It wasn't an actual working firearm. And two, just how sophisticated the detection machines, the X-ray machines at these airports are now. Like, even if you do have a fully plastic device, this wasn't an actual gun, but even the fact that it was fully plastic and they still managed to find it was pretty impressive.
Right. Well, what's playing devil's advocate a little bit, I flew 4 times unintentionally with a pocket knife in my backpack, a foldable pocket knife that I had lost. Turns out I have a backpack from back when I was in college, in undergrad, and it was the first Alienware backpack from Alienware Computers. And so it's got pockets all over because that is cool, I guess. And so I had lost this knife, and apparently it was in one of the pockets of my backpack. And so I flew, from Minnesota, where I am, to Los Angeles, I think to Tahiti, and back, and then back to LA, and then back to Minnesota. And then I also flew down to Dallas, and then back up to Minnesota. And then the next time I went to get on a plane, when the thing was going through, the guy comes up to me and he holds up my pocket knife and he says, "You want to explain this?" And I was like, "Oh my God, you found it." And then I realized how that sounds. So I was like, I mean, I lost this thing like a year ago. And I've had no idea. I guess it was in my backpack the whole time. And he's like, "Well," and it was the same thing. You want to check it? Do you want to call someone to come pick it up? And I'm like, "No, it's like a pocket knife from Home Depot. I don't care. Like, it's all yours, buddy. Throw it away or whatever." But but yeah, there's no charge or anything like that. But it's funny that they found that plastic gun on the guy.
Yeah.
But in my case, it's like, how did you not find this the 4 other flights I had taken? That was wild.
And I don't mean to praise the TSA too much. Obviously, there's been plenty of situations where they were tested and did not find like bomb components and various other weapons. And there it is. That aspect is very much, at least some of that is definitely a security theater thing, because especially the guns, they brag about finding guns all the time. Like, if you follow them on social media, they constantly brag about how they found, "Oh, we found 60 guns this month on people trying to board planes."
Sure.
And it's like literally every single one of those cases is just somebody who forgot that they had it on them.
Right.
And there was no criminal intent to it, and they were not charged. And it was probably like what you described. Now, sometimes these are people, even, and the TSA will admit this when they write about it, but although, sometimes these people get really unlucky, and it's like, if you do that in the wrong state, you could end up with a serious charge. Yeah,
like New York or New Jersey, you can get in a lot of trouble. Or if you're
flying and you get rerouted to a state, you're flying with a gun, you get rerouted to a dark blue state that has really bad gun laws, you could easily end up getting charged. That's happened to people, even if they had no sort of criminal intent, and this was all just a mix-up of travel, basically. you know, so it's most of the time TSA is not going to try and you know, screw you over because you accidentally brought your carry gun, forgot you had it in your bag, and went to board a plane. Usually they'll just be like, "What happened with you?" And they'll say, "Oh, well, you could check this, or you could, you know, have someone come and take it. You know,
Right.
obviously you can't bring it on the plane as checked, you know, as a carry-on, clearly, but usually they're not trying to go after people who just made an innocent mistake." And I think that's what happened with this guy in Reno. He didn't. The stories that I've read are he just basically didn't remember that he had it in his bag.
Yeah, and kind of related to that, but let's see. I mean, this is mildly unrelated. I was just curious if you saw there was a court case, I think a month or two ago, where the court basically determined that the TSA agents were not investigative officers under the law and therefore not subject to Fourth Amendment restrictions, I think is how that ruling turned out. But basically there was some allegations that, you know, they were violating Fourth Amendment protections and doing illegal searches. And the judge was like, well, but they're not investigative officers, which to me was a little bit crazy. Wow. I don't know if you...
That's not crazy. I hadn't heard that.
I'll find that case and send it to you just for your own... your own enjoyment. But that blew my mind. It's like, what do you mean they're not investigative agents? They ask you questions. They go through your stuff. Of course they are. But so I guess getting back to Cody Wilson. So what has been the biggest piece of misinformation that you've been coming across? And I guess following up with that, who is the best media outlet other than the Free Beacon that you found covering it? Because honestly, everybody out there, if you're interested in the Cody Wilson case and you want some good reporting, I've been checking up on Steven's stuff, and as far as I can tell, very thorough, very fair and accurate reporting on it. But is there anybody else that you found that is actually good on this that would maybe surprise people? I haven't, but...
Well, thank you for that, first of all, the compliment. I appreciate that. Obviously, the Free Beacon, we try very hard to, you know, be thorough and accurate. So, especially when it comes to these issues, because so many people aren't. And unfortunately, you know, it's hard for me to pick out, like, an example of a particular outlet or reporter who's just been, like, one, covering the story consistently and also correctly, because there's so many mistakes. Even if it's like, oh, they got this 75% right, but then they got the other 25% so wrong that it's just ruins. Like, I can't share this as like a good example of what's going on, you know. And that's across the board for major outlets, that the Associated Press, New York Times, the Washington Post, the you know, CBS News, you know, MSNBC. It's just nonstop. Like, if I wanted to, if like I hated myself this much, I could just all day long sit there and correct news reports on this, just on this story alone. And, you know, not mentioning the other gun-related stories. Like, that's how bad it's been, and right. You know, the level of coverage. There's been so much of it too. I would say David French at National Review has been very good. He's more of a, you know, opinion you know, guy, but he has a good understanding of the issues at stake. And same for like David Harrisney at the Federalists.
Sure.
You know, these are conservative outlets. These are pro-gun outlets. So that Dana Lash at NRA TV, I did her show the other day, and she had Cody Wilson on before me, and I think she has a very good grasp of the issues at stake. And a lot of misinformation out there. Of course, these are all people who are, you know, pro-gun advocates, right?
Right.
So it's a little bit different than reporters. I wish there were more reporters I could point to as like, oh, this person's been fantastic. Maybe, you know, there's a couple people that I generally follow, like Lois Beckett from The Guardian is generally a very good reporter when it comes to firearms. I don't think she's been doing a lot on this particular story, but She's been great. Some of these people I follow them, but it's hard. I don't know how to pronounce their names, but Polly Mazendez. No, that's probably not right. But she writes for. She actually writes for Bloomberg.
Sure.
Which might seem like a weird person to point out, a weird outlet to point out as a good one for gun coverage, but their news operation is obviously separate from Bloomberg's personal
right
lobbying and political activities. So she's quite good generally, but as far as like covering this specific story, actually it's interesting because that's one of the problems just across the board with firearms, is that the people you see covering this Cody Wilson story on major media outlets, across the board, are generally not people who cover firearms regularly.
Right.
And so I think that plays a big role in why coverage is so bad. Because they're just parachuting in from 30,000 feet. They don't regularly cover this beat. They don't know what's going on with it. They don't understand the laws at play. They haven't been covering the story since 2013, like I have,
Sure. Yeah, I was actually going to ask about that because you mentioned that your particular focus at the Free Beacon is basically gun policy. And I was going to ask if you've run across anyone else at like the major news sites that does that, or if you think that that's a valid criticism of these news sites, is that they, despite having vast resources at a place like a CNN or MSNBC or Associated Press, I mean, effectively unlimited reporting resources, that they don't have dedicated journalists who do this stuff on some of these issues. And even like some crazy far left person who hates guns but is dedicated to it. It's like it's almost like they're just sourcing like Mother Jones or something. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, that's one of my biggest criticisms when it comes to the media coverage of guns. There's obviously, most people on the right, most pro-gun people will look at the inaccuracies in gun coverage and they'll attribute it almost entirely just to liberal bias, right? Oh, they're a bunch of liberals. They hate guns. That's why their coverage is bad. And they're just, and I hear it all the time that when I complain about inaccuracies in coverage, people will say they know better. They just are lying on purpose because they don't like guns. And I don't think that's true. I mean, I certainly would agree that most reporters and mainstream outlets they probably lean to the left personally in their politics. And certainly some reporters are openly liberal and openly biased towards one side. That's obvious. But I would say that your average reporter, especially in print journalism, and I'm a print journalist, so it's
right.
There's perhaps a certain bias there, but myself prefer print to TV or whatever. But I think most of them, especially lower level beat writers, are not necessarily making mistakes because they have a personal animus towards people who own guns or to gun rights or whatever, or that they're liberals, even though they might be. Personally, I think it's more that they just they're just not well informed on the topic, necessarily, and they're not doing it as a beat, so they don't have that sort of background when they go to write a story. A lot of your stories on guns will come from like criminal justice reporters, or like general assignment reporters, or even money, financial reporters, business reporters. And so they're not necessarily people who have a lot of background in reporting on firearms and don't really have the knowledge necessary to do it correctly. And I think as far as your original question of like, who are the people, are there any people at major outlets that are gun reporters that do the gun beat. And I don't, other than the two I just named, Lois Beckett and Polly. All right, let's see if we can
get a pronunciation.
Pronounce Polly's last name correctly. It's spelled Mosendz.
Mosendz.
Yeah.
I got nothing. Mosens?
Yeah. Mosens. Polly Mosens.
Let's go with it.
I think that sounds about right. I'm just sounding it out. Anyway, Polly Mosens at Bloomberg Business Week. She does mostly gun coverage. She's more of a gun beat reporter. Same for Lois Beckett at the Guardian. Now, and that like you alluded to earlier, like Lois Beckett and I probably on a personal level don't agree very much on gun politics or policy or like what we personally think should happen. But that doesn't mean she's a bad reporter, right? Like,
right.
Because she follows the issues, she knows, the various debates going on. She knows the policy and she knows the law behind it all. She can produce some very good, very accurate reporting that I'm very comfortable with sharing. Even a place like The Trace, if you've ever heard of them, The Trace is it's a nonprofit publication focused exclusively on gun issues from a gun control standpoint, right?
Right.
It's sort of like Mother Jones, but just for guns. Like they're open about their mission, which is to cover gun violence and advocate for gun control through producing news stories. But they can produce good journalism because a lot of the people that work there are people who focus exclusively on journalism.
Gotcha.
About guns.
So you mentioned.
Actually,
go ahead.
I'm sorry.
No.
I just had one more thought before we move on.
Yeah, absolutely.
Move on to something else, because this is something that I don't get to talk about it a lot and explain it really well, because most of the time it just boils down to people just, like I said, they just think liberals don't like guns, so liberals in media don't like guns. That's why they're bad at reporting on guns. But I think it goes back to what you'd mentioned earlier, just like CNN and these other large media outlets. They've got lots of resources, right? They've got pretty much every major outlet has at least one labor reporter, right? Just dedicated to labor issues exclusively, right? Labor, the union households in this country are what, like 7% of the country now? I think. Yeah,
I know they've been dropping pretty dramatically.
It's a fairly small percentage. That's not to say that we have a labor reporter at the Free Beacon, Bill McMorris, and he's very good. But it's not to say that that's not an important topic. It's not. It's certainly an important topic worthy of coverage, and I'm not even saying that it's wrong for every outlet to have a labor reporter. They should. I think it's good. But how many households in America report having a firearm? It's like 50%.
Well, I don't know. We need a registry to find out, I think.
Right. But if you look at the polling, it's I think the last poll that I did a piece on, it was like 48% of people report having a gun in the home. It's lower percentages of self-reporting themselves as the owner, but you'll get a little higher percentage of people who just say that somebody in their house has a gun.
Right.
Like, your wife, you might have guns and your wife lives in the same house. So she might not consider herself a gun owner, but she has guns in her home. Right.
I got news for you about the possession laws in your state. If you think that way, by the way,
right.
The prosecuting attorney thinks you own that gun, just so you know.
Exactly. But the point is, like, union households are about 7%, and every major media outlet has a dedicated labor reporter, at least one. Most of them have multiple. They have a whole division.
Right.
Whereas gun households, people who have a gun in their home, it's hundreds of millions of people. It's closer to 50% of the country. And right now there's maybe 3 outlets with gun reporters, like people dedicated to gun issues.
Sure.
You know, it's just insane to me. And even, you know, Lois Beckett's at the Guardian and Polly's at Bloomberg, and those are bigger outlets than the Free Beacon, certainly, but they're not on the same level as CNN, MSNBC, CBS News, ABC. You know,
right?
So nobody at the major outlets has a gun report. Why is that? You don't even need
Fox
to hire
even have one?
Me. Who? No, Fox doesn't have a specific gun beat reporter. They do the same thing as everyone else. They're just, I mean, their perspective is different, right, naturally.
What about the Blaze?
The Blaze? Well, I don't think the Blaze has much original reporter. I don't think they have many original reporters left at all.
They used to have Dana Lash, but they've been cutting everybody, right?
Dana works for the NRA now. You know, she does her own show, but it's NRA TV, right? Like I was saying earlier, she's got a very good understanding of this stuff, but while she is a radio show host, she's a spokesperson for an activist group, right?
Right.
The NRA. So it's a little different. And I'm not even saying it has to be somebody like me. Like, it doesn't have to be somebody who is, more on a personal level, more a gun owner.
I don't see any guns in this picture.
Right, there's no gun. I own this gun. This is a firearm here, according to the ATF.
Right. It looks like you could kill massive amounts of people with that.
Very deadly piece of destruction here. But yeah, that's as I'm sure pretty much everyone in your audience knows, this is the regulated part.
Yeah.
Considered a firearm. I had to do a background check to buy the thing. I haven't put it together into one of those yet, but that'll happen at some point. But yeah, I mean, my point is, like, I would be happy if we just got the major networks to hire even if they hired people from like the Trace, which is openly pro gun control outlet. At least they would be hiring reporters who focus on the issue and like would have basic knowledge.
Right.
You know, I would love it if Lois Beckett got hired by one of these big outlets, even though we don't agree on a personal level about the, what gun policy should be, but just because she's a good reporter.
I find it interesting that the Guardian has a dedicated gun reporter coming, out of the UK.
They're not even an American outlet. They have gun reporters.
So you mentioned, we were talking about Dana Lash, the NRA. I know the NRA has come up in the Cody Wilson story, although they've come up kind of tangentially lately through Trump's tweet, which I don't think we discussed on this recording, but we had kind of talked about it a little bit before the show. And for those of you in the audience who don't know, President Trump tweeted something along the lines of, spoke to the NRA about this 3D plastic gun being sold. Doesn't make much sense, which is it's a weird tweet because I don't know if anybody's selling 3D plastic guns, although I guess that could be. But you being someone who reports on the NRA, I've got kind of conflicting opinions from people that I talk to. Is the NRA, in your opinion, a supporter of guys like Cody Wilson and 3D printed guns, or do they want to see more of like traditional industry production guns being protected and not something like 3D printed guns?
That's a good question. I think it's impossible to say for sure what the NRA thinks about all this beyond what they've said publicly, right? And their public statement after the Trump tweet was essentially to reiterate the fact that the undetectable firearms are in fact illegal, and that the NRA supported that law and continues to support. You know, they supported it when it was passed, and they continue to support it now. So that's all they've really said from a institutional standpoint, coming from, you know, the NRA.
Right.
Dana herself, who of course is an NRA spokesperson, and so presumably most of the things, at least much of what she says, is reflective of what the organization believes, or at least is comfortable with putting out publicly. And you know, she seems fairly supportive of, at least personally, of Cody Wilson. She had him on her show right before I was on, and she certainly has a high level of understanding of the issue at hand. I mean, she generally has a high level of understanding of gun issues. Of course, it's her job.
Right.
But you know, as far as what I would say, the way that I read their response to Trump's tweet was that they don't want to see new laws around this stuff. Mm-hmm. Right? That's how I read it. Right? They're like, hey, we already have a law that deals with plastic guns.
Right.
And we don't need to be messing with that. Because if I recall, so one of the interesting things about the Undetectable Firearms Act is that it sunsets after 10 years. So it needs to be renewed every 10 years, kind of like the federal assault weapons ban, except that they never renewed that.
Thank God.
And so the last time this was up for renewal in 2013, or whenever the last time it was up for renewal.
Sure.
It wasn't that long ago, but you know, Democrats tried to add stuff to it, basically, that the NRA didn't support, and you know, gun rights advocates wouldn't support. And so I think they're concerned about something like that, like this becoming an avenue for instituting new forms of gun control that reach well beyond, like, you know, whether or not you can print this you know, proof of concept single shot 22 pistol.
Right. Out of curiosity, should someone somehow create a fully undetectable gun, made completely of plastic, polymer bullets, the only thing in there you've got is some sort of ignitable substance to propel the bullet, or if you could somehow, I don't see how you could do it magnetically without metal, but let's create some special force where you could actually get this thing past any sort of detection. Where do you stand on that issue? Because for me, I think that even because I'm kind of weird like this, but well, maybe it's not weird, but I think if you could make that, I don't see a law like that being technically constitutional. Now, I think a court has upheld the Undetectable Firearms Act or whatever, but like when I read the Second Amendment, the right to keep and bear arms, I don't see any of the qualifications that they put into it over the past century, really, since U.S. v. Miller, about like this idea of making it undetectable or making it somehow more dangerous precludes ownership. But where do you fall on that issue?
Yeah, you know, as a reporter, I try not to take sides on these kinds of things.
Well, and you certainly
like
don't.
Super hypothetical.
You certainly don't have to.
Sure, especially on like super hypothetical questions like that. But you know, one of the interesting things about the Undetectable Firearms Act, at least from what Cody Wilson told me, and I'm not an expert, perhaps you know more about it than I do, but and you could correct me if I'm wrong here, but he told me that essentially it's never been enforced. Like, there's never been a case where someone's been arrested for having an undetectable firearm. Because as far as I understand it, there's, and your hypothetical would point out, there's no current technology to create such a gun.
Yeah, it's always... It's kind of funny because... Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, you go.
Well, it's always, you know, like in movies or whatever, someone will have crafted a gun out of zinc or something, you know, some ridiculous pseudo metallic, like I think an elemental metal structure, but that wouldn't be detectable because it's not made out of commonly detectable metal parts or something. That's how it always works out in like a Bond movie or something.
Yeah, but that's sci-fi, you know.
Right.
Like in real life, the closest thing we've got is probably the Liberator, because it's mostly plastic parts, but it has a metal firing pin and metal plate in it as well, I believe. But uh, um, but as far as like, if it were possible, would it be constitutional to restrict those? I don't know. For certainly, you know, I think we live in a world that's governed more by practical compromises than we might like, right? Especially as people, you know, especially if you're someone who's like very strongly, a very strong believer in certain philosophical principles, like, you know, the Bill of Rights or something like that, or just you know, the general idea of natural rights. Because, you know, you look at something like Heller and MacDonald and how those are crafted, and those are viewed correctly as very big wins for individual gun rights, you know, establishing protections for individual gun rights. But if you read those rulings, they're really crafted. They're a product of compromise, right? They're crafted in such a way as to make the specific laws that they're dealing with unconstitutional without creating a large cascade effect and declaring a bunch of other laws unconstitutional. And that's generally how the Supreme Court, especially with Roberts, in my view, has crafted their rules. They try to be as narrow as possible, and less so on the you know, where like someone like you or I might want to make a broad sweeping declaration about what our rights are. The Supreme Court in practice is much less inclined to do that.
Right.
So if you were to make an undetectable firearm in real life and you somehow got caught with that, I guess you would, I don't know how that would, what the scenario would be here, but if you got charged under that law, and it's my understanding that no one's ever been charged under it, I wouldn't be shocked if the federal courts upheld it as constitutional.
Oh, I think they absolutely would. The interesting, it's kind of interesting you brought up how the Supreme Court tends to narrowly focus their decisions. That was one of the hardest things drilled into me personally, and I guess my classmates in our constitutional law class, was really narrowing down while we were in law school. Like, our professor would ask the class, what is this case about? And then someone would answer and he'd say, no, you know, narrower, narrower, narrower. And it was always like, you'd get into this weird, like, 3-phrase long sentence with a bunch of semicolons involved as to how it's like Korematsu, which I think is one of the worst decisions ever. It's like, can the president of the United States in a time of war lawfully remove from their property, and in turn people based on race, based on this idea that they're, you know, that we're at war with their country of origin, all this stuff. And like the number of qualifications that you get to, it really does kind of change how you look at Supreme Court cases. And it's one of my biggest frustrations is we'll get a ruling on something and they're like, and you'll get any number of media outlets or at my best is the Twitter legal experts, my favorite people on earth, saying this means, and it's this like huge sweeping thing that they're deciding. It's like, no, like the cake, the gay wedding cake, right? Like, people are like, oh, this means that bakers don't have to make cakes. And it's like, if you read that opinion, Kennedy pretty much says he had to make the cake, but it was really limited to this one issue where, because the Colorado Civil Rights Division was so just flat out rude to him about his faith, that's what the whole problem was. But that if it came up today in the same circumstances, he probably has to make the cake. But if you read people's reactions to that decision, they lost their minds. It was great.
You know, and this really was driven home for me recently, in regards to Heller and MacDonald, by reading Brett Kavanaugh's opinion in Heller 2. I don't know. Have you read that?
No, I haven't. I'll have to check it out for sure.
Yeah, it's his dissent in the case where basically, you know, it's the one that is reassures like gun rights proponents that yes, Brett Kavanaugh is probably a good pick. That's if you're a gun rights proponent, right? Because
Sure.
just read this opinion and he outlines his view of constitutional. And it's where he says that DC's gun registration scheme and their assault weapons ban is unconstitutional as applied. As Heller applied the Second Amendment.
Mm-hmm.
But the interesting thing about reading through that, a very well written opinion, on Kavanaugh's part, is I think he has probably the best understanding of Heller and McDonald that I've read personally, in terms of like what does it actually mean, especially when you look at how some other federal courts have dealt with that ruling,
right?
And I think in large part to try and just sort of get around it as much as they can. But he focuses on the idea that Heller and McDonald set up this very specific test that's different from other more commonly used and widely known tests like strict scrutiny or intermediate scrutiny, right? He says the court rejected in Heller any balancing test, which is what strict scrutiny and intermediate scrutiny are, right? Because they balance the interest of the state versus the right in question. And he says, Heller sets up a different standard, different tests, calls it, I believe, a history, text, and tradition test, which basically is the basic idea is that as long as a gun regulation, a gun law has been around for long enough and is widely adopted enough, it's probably constitutional, is more or less this what he says the Heller standard is, right?
Sure.
So, and that screams to me compromise, right? The whole idea is like when the court took on Heller, they wanted to be like, the Second Amendment means something. It has to mean something, right? It's not meaningless, not pointless. It's there for a reason. It has some force of law, right?
Right.
It's not something you can just ignore. But also, we don't want to. We have to get Kennedy on board with this ruling. We have to preserve an actual majority here. So we don't want to go too far and uproot all these long-standing gun regulations and gun laws. So they basically just said, well, if it's not very new and it's not very widespread, it's probably unconstitutional, right? So which, in the case of Heller and McDonald, it fits perfectly because handgun bans were not very new and they were not very widespread. And so the court said they were unconstitutional.
Right. That's actually one of my biggest complaints about Heller is that Scalia, I mean, he makes this wonderful analysis of the history of militia involvement, of what kind of firearms we're talking about, how basically everyone was expected to bring a firearm to the militia, and you really only got provided a firearm if you could prove some sort of financial burden and all of this stuff. Uh-huh. And then in Heller, he's like, but the Second Amendment applies to weapons in common use for self-defense.
Right.
And not military weapons. And I'm like, wait a minute. Like, you just spent this whole thing talking about what a well-regulated militia was, what kind of weapons they're expected to bring, like the weapons of war at the time of the adoption of the amendment. And then you come out and say, like, an AR-15 might not be covered. It's like, well, wait a minute. Like, or I guess an AR-15 probably is just because it's so prolific in the U.S., but maybe not an AK-47, or maybe not a Bushmaster 50 caliber or something like that.
Right. Something like, they didn't want to strike down the NFA, right? Because that had been around for 100 years or so by that point.
And man, do I hate it. Oh, I hate it.
Yeah. Although, it's interesting in Kavanaugh's dissent, he mentions this. He talks about fully automatic weapons and why it's okay that they're banned because that is a long-standing regulation, and that's not really true. I mean, the NFA has been around for a long time, relatively. I mean, it's 20th century law, but certainly much longer than a lot of the other more radical gun laws, like assault weapons bans and gun
Right.
registration and handgun bans, things like that. But you know, the full ban on the sale of fully automatic weapons didn't happen until 1986. So
Right.
it's certainly not long standing by any stretch of the imagination. So, you know, and so even then, it's interesting to see how they apply these tests, because, like, all right, and he mentions in there, like, really the history, texts, tradition test is less strict than strict scrutiny. Like, some of these gun laws that exist and have been around perhaps for much longer periods of time than handgun bans or you know, assault weapons bans or what have you, gun registration, they might not survive strict scrutiny,
Right.
You know, test. You know, and so instead of applying strict scrutiny, they went with this other really very unique test, for just so that you know, you could argue because they wanted to because they had to compromise on it. And so it's less about this this sort of philosophical declaration of our rights and more about just practical application in real life is not quite that clean.
Yeah. You reported on the Ninth Circuit basically creating open carry through its recent ruling, if I remember right. Did you reported on that, correct?
Yes.
What stood out to me in that decision, and maybe it did, so they took a different approach to Kavanaugh. What they basically did was applied, I believe, intermediate scrutiny, but they still found that that basically, if you're not going to allow licensing, or if you have an arbitrary restriction on licensing for open carry, or for concealed carry, then you have to allow open carry, which is pretty consistent with other circuit appellate courts. But the one thing that got me, what was it? It was a specific line. Oh gosh, I was just thinking about it, and now it's eluding me. About what was it? Dang it. It was the judge was commenting on US v. Miller, and maybe you caught this, maybe you didn't, but he talked about how the pleading in US v. Miller was basically deficient, how the complaint was brought in US v. Miller and really lacked any sort of evidence to back it up, which I found to be fascinating, because if you look at things like kind of the other factors that play into, which are usually like temporal factors that play into Supreme Court decisions, and you look at US v. Miller, you've got 1939 it's decided. You've got FDR in office. You've got him at that point having already threatened the Supreme Court. And you've got this problem following Prohibition of mobsters basically killing people in the street. You've got the St. Valentine's Day Massacre that pretty much prompted the National Firearms Act. You've got all this context going into it. And you think of like US v. Miller being improperly pled, and just like that little line in that decision was like, oh man, this guy might really hate that decision. And you wonder if it leaves it vulnerable. I was wondering, did you happen to catch that line in the decision? Did it spark anything for you? Because for me, it was like, well, now I want to know more about it. I want to know more about the pleading of US v. Miller. I haven't had time to research it since then.
Yeah.
But.
Well, Miller's the case where they declared that the NFA was constitutional because, or basically they just declared that short-barreled shotguns were not useful for militia service and therefore outside of the protection of the Second Amendment.
Right.
And then really didn't go any further than that. That was pretty much the whole.
And that's the basis for
because gun control people point to that case all the time.
But
they're like, oh, that means gun control is legal.
It's where they held up it's where they held up the National Firearms Act, which I think was passed in 1932. But, and it was the controlling case from 1939 pretty much to 2008.
Right.
So, I mean, just
massively.
But
what they declared in that case was like, you know, it wasn't like Heller where they took a stand on the more philosophical grounds of like, oh, the Second Amendment means something, at least it protects an individual right, whereas in Miller the court was really just focused on whether or not the particular firearm in question was protected by the Second Amendment, and they declared that because they sawed off shot. It's sort of like, I think there's plenty of criticism you can levy at that, and certainly gun rights opponents don't like it for obvious reasons, but you know, they're basically just saying, oh, this particular gun, that question in this case, a sawed-off shotgun, not something that's useful in militia or military service, therefore it's not protected by the Second Amendment.
I think that's,
I mean, as far as like whether or not that could be something that comes back under review, I mean, you know, the judge in that case is fascinating, I think, because he's the same, the judge who wrote that decision, the majority opinion, is the same one who wrote the majority opinion in Peruta at the panel level. What's it called when it's just the 3-judge panel?
I mean, that's just the appellate decision, unless you're talking about an en banc hearing.
No, before en banc was, I guess they're just appellate. The original appellate decision in Peruta was the same judge writing the opinion, as far as I understand it. You know, feel free to fact check me on this, but that was my understanding.
No, I'll take your word for it.
The decision which overturned the May issue concealed carry law in California, and then that went to en banc, and they reversed his decision, and then now he's back with another case that says, and it's kind of funny in that context, if you read the opinion, he's like, well, okay, since the Ninth Circuit has ruled that we, concealed carry is not protected, that must mean that open carry is protected because the right to bear arms is explicitly written out in the Second Amendment there. So you must have one or the other. So one or the other must be protected. And since the Ninth Circuit overruled me and said that concealed carry is not protected, that must mean that open carry is protected. And so, you know, he's got this new ruling now saying as much. And I think my guess is that it'll probably be overturned when the rest of the Ninth Circuit gets a hold of it, but you never know. I think one of the most interesting things about that case is the plaintiff. How much do you know about him?
I don't know anything other than what was in the document, which is that basically he's a presumably law-abiding citizen with no special reason to own a gun other than that he just wanted one, which that's what I've got. I haven't looked into him at all, but I would love to hear some insight on him.
He has a fascinating story. And now I'm blanking on his last name. His first name's George. Let me look this up real quick.
That's what I was doing just now.
I think it's George. George. His lawyer's name is Alan Beck. He's a California lawyer.
George Young Jr.
George Young. That's exactly right. George Young. The fascinating thing about him and about this case generally, to me, is that it came out of nowhere, right? I mean, I don't know if you realize this, but or most people realize this, but this was not usually in these kind of cases like Heller, McDonald, are pushed by, you know, large gun control groups are the ones that they find the plaintiffs, they find the case, and this is true for a lot of big time, you know, litigation, right?
And most people don't realize that lots of them, like Heller, I believe, there were several similarly situated plaintiffs who had all filed claims.
Yes.
And then they had a lot of these organizations backing individuals in their individual claims, and then they all get lumped together when they get to the Supreme Court level. And that's just kind of how the Supreme Court takes these cases.
Right. that's super common, right? You might have competing cases from different, especially in the gun realm, from different gun rights groups. They don't often work together. I mean, sometimes they do, but like the Second Amendment Foundation will file their own suit with their own plaintiffs, then the NRA will file their own suit with their own plaintiffs,
right,
and so on and so forth. The interesting thing about this case is that George Young filed this case on his own.
Yeah, he was pro se.
Originally, he actually filed two. This is the third time he filed against Hawaii over this, over not being granted a carry permit. Right. The first two times he did it on his own without any legal help whatsoever. He couldn't get a lawyer to help him in Hawaii. No one would take his case.
Right.
So he did his own research. I actually have an interview. I'm doing a profile on George Young. Did an interview with him this week. And this guy went out. He was annoyed that he couldn't get his carry license. He wants to be able to carry, when he's out and about on the island, protect himself from wild hogs, from, someone attacking him, whatever. And when he found out he couldn't get a permit because Hawaii issues literally 0 permits.
Right.
The last 2 years they've issued not a single permit to any civilians in the entire state of Hawaii. It's the only state in the country that you could say that. Even, New Jersey and California, New York, Maryland, they all actually issue a few permits at least, right? To keep up the appearance that, oh yeah, we're issuing permits. We just have our own special, very selective system for doing it. Whatever. Hawaii doesn't even bother with that pretense. They just don't give anyone a permit. And so he didn't like that, and no one, no lawyers would help. So he researched the law on his own, filed his own cases, and had them both thrown out. But he knew enough too. The interesting thing is that, usually, and I'm sure you can speak to this, but generally when you file a case like that, you can't refile it again after it's been thrown out, right?
Right. Yeah, typically the dismissal is going to be with prejudice, especially if you have like a failure to state a claim dismissal or something like that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're really hard pressed to file it again.
And so, at least from my understanding, how it was explained to me by Alan Beck, George Young's lawyer, you can refile if the law is substantially changed, right? Like, and so in this case, it was because there had been a number of rulings that affected gun laws throughout the country, and so he was able to refile again, and then it got thrown out again. And then he was able to refile again, but this time he had met Alan Beck, and Alan Beck, more or less, as far as I understand it, more or less the story was just like Alan Beck, they'd been talking to one another, about gun rights issues. Alan Beck is like a gun lawyer, and so he's involved in some gun cases, and he has business in Hawaii, and so they'd been talking, and then George had shared his story, and Alan Beck basically, from what he told me, is like, this guy he did all this work and has all this determination, and he kept trying to get his day in court, and they wouldn't even hear him, and I guess from what he explained, that normally in that situation where you're representing yourself in a suit like that, the court will at least hear you, like they'll let you come into court, and
they're not supposed to. Basically the rule is you're treated as if you are represented. But the way the courts tend to work that out is, but that's a little unreasonable to put on a normal person, especially when we put all these licensure requirements on attorneys to have all this specialized training. And then we say, but if you just can't afford one, well, too bad. So they're not supposed to, under the rules, give leeway to pro se litigants, but a lot of times they do, just recognizing how difficult it is.
Right. And so I guess Alan Beck's thought on this was like, after he'd heard what George Young was doing, he thought, well, this guy at least deserves a day in court, and so I'll help him pro bono to get this case filed properly, or like, with more advantageously. and that he's like, I told him I can at least get you your day in court. I can't guarantee anything's going to come of this. And honestly, it didn't seem like I don't think he thought that anything was necessarily going to come of this. I don't think he expected this ruling, and he certainly didn't. From what I could tell, he didn't expect it to come down when it did. Like, it surprised everyone. This thing came out of nowhere. No, none of the big gun rights knew about it. I got a tip from, like, I think it was the people at Maryland shall carry. Some of their lawyers were following along with it. Like, they'd taken notice of it. And so, like, this thing came out of nowhere, and it's just got this fascinating plaintiff. You know, this guy's story is amazing. Like, he's a Vietnam vet. He is native Hawaiian as well. So, and he's lived there his entire life. And, you know, he told me the story about how he's with his daughter, one of his daughters, and he was hanging a picture of Charlton Heston from, with a famous picture from my cold dead hands
yeah
picture. And, she was like, well, why, you can't do that in Hawaii. You can't, carry a gun. And he's like, sure I can. It's my right, and he went to prove that, and then they denied his permit, and his daughter unfortunately passed away in a car accident. And so it's sort of part of this is that he's like trying to honor a memory by changing this law so that he can carry. It's a pretty fascinating story. This guy's he's been doing this for like 15 years too. This guy is super dedicated.
Sure. What's crazy is he would have been born before Hawaii was a state, right? Hawaii would have been a U.S. territory when he first lived there. Right. And it's probably interesting because I bet, when he was younger, gun ownership in Hawaii was probably not an issue, like not a crazy issue.
I wonder though. I wonder if that's true because
I don't know.
It seems to me, it seems to me that the American territories, especially our Pacific Islands, are some of the worst offenders when it comes to infringing on people's gun rights.
Sure.
So I wonder. I don't know.
You'll have to ask him.
Maybe back then it wasn't as much of an issue. These are probably more modern rules about outright gun bans in the Virgin Islands and things like that.
That's something that I have, as I've just gotten older and run into more, I guess, stories. That's always piqued my interest. Is like, now that you mentioned George Young and how he's just this fascinating guy, it's like how interesting the lives are of the people that we don't ever consider. Like, the guy in Heller, for example, is, he's a cop. And it's like, I bet if you sat down with Heller and talked about his life story, it would just blow the minds of the average person. And I have this weird idea that pretty much everybody is that way. That when you sit down, just because everybody's lived experience is going to be so much different than your own, when you start to peel back the layers of what's behind a person, I'm just more and more fascinated by that. That's one thing that I kind of envy about guys in your field, reporters, is that they get to peel back those layers and really learn just a fantastic story.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great point. And one of the things I like to do most in this field, in this beat, is like talk to the people behind these cases, because they generally do have fascinating stories, and they're like real people with real motivations. Like, it's not just some abstract concept at that point. Like, when you talk to Dick Heller or George Young or Otis McDonald or the people, any of these people behind these cases, generally, obviously there's, plaintiff shopping that goes on when you're trying to, if you're like a big gun rights group and you're trying to pick, a plaintiff to make a case go as far as possible, there's plaintiff shopping that goes on with that. But a lot of these cases are not necessarily built that way, right? Like George Young is a perfect example of that. Like, a lot of these people really are injured by these laws.
Absolutely.
And really do have very significant very legitimate reasons why they want them changed. And, you know, you talk to them and, you know, your heart can break for them. There's one great example of this is the woman in New Jersey who she was from Pennsylvania. She was I'm trying to think of her name. I've met her.
Oh, is this the lady who like traveled to New Jersey, had a gun in her purse, got arrested for it?
That's exactly right. I'm trying to.
I was going to ask you earlier what if you ever knew what happened to her, but it sounds like you might.
Well, she was it Shannon? Gosh, I really wish I could remember her name at this second. She's become something of a gun rights activist since this happened to her. But the basic story was she was on her way to a birthday party for one of her children in Atlantic City. Actually, she was going to the Trump casino. This is just a random side point. It doesn't have anything to do with what happened to her, but it's a bizarre coincidence, I guess. She had gotten like a coupon for like $1 to rent a room at the.
Is it Shanine Allen?
Shanine Allen, that's exactly it. Yes, Shanine Allen. She is a single mother from Philadelphia at the time. She had been robbed several times and had, because of that, had obtained a Pennsylvania concealed carry license, right? And was legally owned a handgun and had the license to carry it in Pennsylvania. Unfortunately, what no one told her when she obtained that license was that it was not good in New Jersey. New Jersey does not have reciprocity with any other states.
Lovely.
Not Pennsylvania, even though they're a neighboring state. And so she was on her way to a birthday party for her young son at the Trump casino, and was pulled over and by a police officer in New Jersey, and informed the officer when he came up to the car that she had her firearm in her purse because she thought that's what she was supposed to do.
Right.
And unfortunately, it's illegal. You know, the permit's not good in New Jersey, so she was arrested, and she was kept in custody for like a month. She was in prison.
Right.
I believe at least a month.
Because I'm sure she was so dangerous that they had to impose an absolutely astronomical bail amount for her.
Yeah, well, she's a big threat. Single mother, you know, obviously can't have people like that on the streets.
Right.
But regardless, so she, you know, she did break the law. She didn't know about the, you know, in this case, she was simply ignorant of the law itself, and that's what got her in trouble, unfortunately. But she lost her job. She, you know, was separated from her children for the period of time that she was in prison. She was lucky in the sense that Chris Christie was governor at the time and ended up pardoning her because the attorney general was prosecuting her.
Jeez.
And so, you know, she is now a gun rights activist who speaks on the issue. She was at last year's gun rights policy conference with the Second Amendment Foundation. So I think she's done some things with the NRA as well. But that's a perfect example of somebody who really experienced the full weight of the consequences of running afoul of some of these laws that many people might question the legitimacy or logic of.
Yeah, what's it going to take for us to get reciprocity of carry licenses to be recognized? Like that's one of those crazy things where it's like the licenses of one state and the permissions are given full faith and credit in every state as far as like driving permits, marriage licenses, but an actual enumerated right, not that one though. It just blows my mind.
Right. I mean, certainly that's a point that gets brought up a lot when you talk about reciprocity. Boy, what's it going to take to get us there? I suppose it depends on how you think the elections are going to go in the next couple of years here.
Yeah,
like
I suppose.
If you think that Republicans are going to retain the presidency and the House and Senate and actually increase their majorities, then I would think your most likely path is, the National Reciprocity Act, which is basically dead, along with every other gun legislation since, probably March of this year, the Parkland shooting.
Right.
It just isn't. And then now there just isn't enough time to do any real serious legislation before the midterms. So they're not going to take up gun legislation at this point. I mean, outside of maybe some showboats, I don't know.
Sure.
But, so
plus we got to decide if Trump needs to be impeached. That
right.
very important decision.
Well, that's the thing. If you think Republicans are going to gain a larger majority, or maybe pro-gun Democrats are going to become elected, if they still have those out there, because they're less and less common. But then yes, maybe you'll get the legislation, and there'll be a legislative fix for that. If you think Democrats are going to take control of the House, or one or two of the chambers, then yeah, that's probably going to end up just being nonstop focused on Trump and impeaching Trump, and just gridlock basically, as far as practical legislation is concerned. And then you'll have to hope that the court system will be the one to determine this, sort of like in what was it, Oberfeld, the gay marriage case,
right? Yeah,
because the argument, like you just said, right? The argument, as you just articulated, is basically like, well, I mean, if you're saying that every state has to honor even gay marriages, even in states where it's not legal, then why not? Why not concealed carry permits as well?
Right.
That would, and that'll all come down to how elections go. And after the last election, I'm not one for predicting how elections go anymore.
Yeah, I have no idea. I think that the Republicans may maintain their majority, and the only basis I have for that is that so many people are reporting about a blue wave and them losing the majority, that I just think that if that's the reporting, I have to think the opposite.
Yeah.
But it certainly could happen.
I just, after 2016, I'm just like, it's outside of my beat. I'm not going to bother to pretend like I can predict what's going to happen in the election.
I think all the guys who are in that beat need to probably reconsider their ability to predict that as well.
Probably. But yeah, so it's like, it really depends on how the politics go as to what's the most likely path for something like national reciprocity, or even things like silencer reform.
Oh man, that's got to come off of the NFA. Suppressors on the NFA is one of the dumbest things, propagated by, in my opinion, the movie portrayal of what a suppressor is. And I love me some Steven Seagal, but I blame him almost entirely for it, because was it in either On Deadly Ground or Fire Down Below, which are like the exact same movie. He duct tapes a 2-liter bottle to the end of his gun and then uses that, and it's like an absolutely silent shot. I love it.
Yeah, there's plenty of misinformation on silencers, just like 3D printed guns. That's one of the most misunderstood firearms accessories that exists, I would say. And honestly, personally, I would say there's some misinformation even on the pro-gun side of it, because there are people out there, and probably people in the chat for this video will complain about me using the term silencer, which I think is, like, I understand the objection in terms of it doesn't make a gunshot silent, obviously. I mean, I've shot them before. I understand what they do. Suppressor is a more accurate term in terms of the actual effect of the device. But silencer is also the name that the man who invented them gave them, Hiram Percy Maxim. It's also the name that the ATF uses, the term that it uses to describe them. And it's also the name of manufacturer of them, Silencer Co.
Sure.
So sometimes you see out there, I've even seen the NRA do this, where they're like, anyone who uses the term silencer, anti-gun, zealot who doesn't know what they're talking about. It's like, all right, calm down. You can call them silencers. I get what you're saying. I get the objection, but like you can call them. That's also what everyone knows them too. Just you're the average person.
Yeah.
Suppressor is an industry.
I'm less concerned about the term and more concerned about the idea that several people seem to think that is what they actually do, rather than that is a very effective piece of marketing. And I mean, in some respects, like if you're shooting a large caliber rifle in a place where there are other people anywhere nearby, it's actually really nice to have a silencer or suppressor around, because it's my parents have a house next to a gun range, and even me, who's very, I'm openly pro gun and happy to shoot, but when I'm outside at their house with my kids running around and someone starts firing, there's that quick moment where it's like, what the heck's happening, right? And so it's very jarring. It's a very loud sound, but I just, what bothers me is not the people who say the word silencer, but it's the people who adopt the idea that this makes a gun somehow more dangerous, which is, that's the wild part.
Yeah, I think that's 100% the right way to look at it. And that's how I look at it as well. Like, I'll use the term silencer because people know, and it's also for the reasons that I explained, a perfectly legitimate term. But, I will criticize people, and I have many times before, who depict silencers as literally making a gun silent to the point like it is in a video game or on TV, because that's just not true. It's false. It's a lie.
Right.
But and honestly, the industry, the activist line on silencers and why we need to take them off the NFA is because it's called the Hearing Protection Act for a reason, right? Their line is that this legitimately is a safety device, and I think that's true, right? I mean, I think there's legitimacy to that claim. Like, it's not an absurd thing to say, and especially when you consider how many people hunt in this country, which is without hearing protection, so that they can, listen for whatever they're trying to hunt, and therefore they get hearing damage from shooting firearms without hearing protection. Yeah. And if they had silencers, that'd be less likely.
Well, and if you've got, in my experience, I've got the disposable earplugs, but I also have, I have a set of, not these, but a set of active noise reduction headphones that are specifically for firing. But if I've got my rifle up to my shoulder, that's hitting against the, it's hitting against the earphone, and it's causing trouble with the shot. But we've been going a while here, and I've kept you a long time with the setup and everything, so we should probably wrap this up. But I've really enjoyed this interview, and so if you ever want to address my audience on any of these issues, if you want to talk on any of the law stuff that comes out, certainly shoot me a message. I would love to have you on the show again. You're extremely knowledgeable. I know that I'll be following your stuff on this gun policy stuff, because as an attorney with an active practice, I don't have very many gun issues. I live in rural Minnesota, so we're pretty understanding of where guns belong, which is everywhere. But and so I don't run into this much, but I love to follow these cases. I find them fascinating. So I'll definitely be relying on you for accurate reporting and stuff like that. So don't let me down. No, I'm just kidding. But it's been a real pleasure. So
yeah, this has been fantastic. I appreciate you having me on.
Absolutely. Well, I'm going to go ahead and kill the recording here, and then you and I can chat for just a minute before. I'm not going to just cut you off and hang up on you. So, well, thanks for watching, guys. Of course, you can check me out on patreon.com/lawsplaining. You can find Steven on the Washington Free Beacon. Do you have anywhere else that people can find you that you report, or should they?
Yeah, Twitter. Twitter.com/Steven Gutowski. It's STEPHENGUTOWSKI.
And I'm going to include.
So sometimes I'll have stuff on there that's not necessarily in the story, just additional information.
Right. I'm going to include both the Twitter link for Steven and the Washington Free Beacon link down in the description below. So certainly check them out. If you haven't ever seen the Washington Free Beacon, they do great reporting. And they sometimes do really funny stuff too. If I remember right, they did some supercuts of like Obama speeches where he would have minor vocal tics or whatever, and they would just string them all together from one speech. Those were hilarious to me, but
yeah, still do that. Still do those supercuts. They're usually very entertaining.
Yeah. So anyways, thank you guys for watching as always. And let me know in the comments if you want to hear anything more about these issues. If you have any, if you think I'm terrible or that we've got something completely wrong, please yell at us so we can make sure and correct that. Thanks, guys.